me, I'm probably going to mispronounce some names here, but we are talking medieval, and this one is directed by Peter Žižka, who also co-wrote the movie. This is a Czech movie, purportedly the most expensive Czech movie ever made. And although it is a Czech movie, it's actually spoken in English language, and is a historical kind of epic movie, you can probably guess, taking place in the medieval ages. And this is about a historical figure, Jan Zizka, and again, apologies if I've mispronounced the names here, and he's played by Ben Foster. You've also got a supporting role here by Michael Caine. Now, the basic premise of this story is Zizka is a kind of a leader of a group of soldiers, ultimately. I think he's like a mercenary group, at least for the looks of it in this movie. And if you think I'm sounding unsure here, I'll tell you why that is in just a little bit. Anyway, and it ultimately comes down to a power struggle between two factions in Europe, vying for power, which is causing strife amongst the people. And obviously you've kind of got supporters on both sides. And Ben Foster's character of Jan is kind of a leader of this kind of like group of soldiers, as I say, and he is tasked to ultimately kidnap someone important to ultimately use this as leverage, and that kind of is the basis of the majority of the screen time here, and we follow the kidnapping, the fallout from that, and ultimately the kind of the conflict that resulted in it. And that's your kind of your basic plot premise. Now let's talk about what works. So if you're a fan of movies like Braveheart, things like that, then you may want to check this one out. You know, it's maybe not quite as epic as kind of like the Braveheart, Gladiator and things like that, but I do think you can probably have it in that kind of same conversation. Obviously the production value here is quite impressive, large scale kind of battles, lots of extras, lots of kind of detail gone into the kind of the costuming and things like this. You know, we have some quite interesting kind of battle sequences. Zizka, as a historical figure, was quite innovative in the way he approached kind of warfare, and apparently never actually kind of lost a fight. And he could have used the environment to his advantage. He was quite, you know, forward thinking in his use of kind of military equipment and things like this. So, you know, you kind of see him use his brain as much as he's kind of broaden this this movie, this conflict, which makes him for quite an interesting character. And I have to say here, I think for the most part the acting is very strong. Ben Foster, of course, is our lead kind of character here, playing a historical figure. You do feel his acting is little heart out, bless him, and you've got some decent kind of supporting cast here as well, who I think do a kind of a good job. The movie has a very kind of like muddy feel to it. It's the best way I would kind of describe it. It focuses as a positive and a negative. The positives I'll talk about now, the negatives I'll talk about in just a minute. But on the positive side, I do feel this feels very dirty and gritty. You know, the kind of the combat sequences, they don't feel over kind of like stylized. They don't feel too kind of like Hollywoodized, if that's kind of a word. It feels kind of like dirty, gritty, you know, just kind of like a real kind of slog to get through in some ways, but it kind of gives it, you're feeling like you're kind of giving it somewhat of a kind of a realistic feel. The movie is also fairly gory. Some of the kind of the sequences with people's, you know, limbs getting chopped off. There's a sequence where a character is impaled, by the looks of it, through his butt, and it's still alive and things like that, and it's like he's only like a young lad and stuff. It's quite harrowing almost at times to kind of like see the level of kind of violence inflicted upon other humans, you know, from this movie, how it kind of depicts kind of the warfare and the kind of the torture that is implemented on kind of people, and just the kind of like the lack of kind of humanity and the barbarity of this kind of period of history. And arguably someone might say it's not much changed all that much, but there you go. So it certainly has a gritty, muddy, bloody feel to it that kind of gives it a somewhat of a, you know, somewhat of a realistic edge. I mean, obviously, you know, who can say what it was really like, but it feels kind of like somewhat kind of authentic. And like I say, it really helps in the fact that they have spent a lot of time here with the kind of the set decoration, you know, the costuming and things like this, and, you know, people just getting absolutely caked in mud and blood and things like that. And you know, there are some sequences here that I think are kind of particularly well shot. It is a little bit of a mixed bag on regards to cinematography, and again I'll touch on that in a minute. But there are some sequences here that I do feel are quite kind of cinematic and kind of feel like, you know, they belong up there with the likes of kind of Gladiator and kind of Braveheart and things like this. And it's a character I'm not, or a historical figure I'm not particularly familiar with. And I think it certainly shines a light on, you know, for me at least, otherwise kind of somewhat unknown, but very interesting kind of figure from history. So therein lies one of the issues, and we'll transition to maybe now what I don't think works. I actually think this is going to be beneficial to viewers if you have some idea of the real historical events. Because unlike a movie like Gladiator or Braveheart, the narrative and the storytelling skill here is not as strong. So if you have a basic understanding of what the actual events were, I feel like you might enjoy this movie more, because it doesn't do a particularly kind of good job of setting the stage, you know, kind of giving you these characters that are kind of memorable, and some other issues that we'll talk about in a minute. So let me just kind of reiterate and kind of go into a little bit more detail. So the movie kind of starts off with a kind of an action sequence and things like that, and kind of it tries to establish the status quo in regards to, you know, who are the players and things like that. But I don't really feel it does a particularly kind of good job in setting up who are the kind of the players behind the scenes so much. You know, we get Jan Zizka and his kind of group of men who I think you can kind of get an idea who they are. But there are other kind of players who are, you know, higher up the food chain. And those characters in particular, I feel, are sorely underdeveloped. A lot of people kind of like, you just don't know who they're referring to. The world isn't kind of set up. The history isn't particularly set up. So you kind of become a little lost in regards to following kind of certain characters' trajectories and their arcs and things like that. Now this is further hampered by some other issues. On the technical side, I've already mentioned the cinematography here, but it does feel a little bit dreary at times. Even some of the action sequences, because of this kind of like this muddy aesthetic that I've mentioned, realistic as it might be, sometimes it kind of feels like you can't really see what's kind of going on. And a lot of it ultimately doesn't look particularly kind of cinematic. It might look more gritty and real, but as a film, you kind of thinking, it just kind of looks like a crowd of people kind of like, you know, fighting and things like this, and in some of the kind of the battle sequences. And even kind of in some of the slower scenes, it's a kind of a very kind of dreary look to the film. Now, some people might like that. Some people might say, oh, you know, it's a gloomy time of in history and stuff, so therefore it's kind of representative, and now I understand that. But as a kind of, when you're trying to follow it, visually speaking, you know, it's sometimes a little muddled. But that's not the only problem. The sound quality here, on a technical level, I think is worse than the visuals. The visual, I think you can get away with. But there are other issues that I think really kind of compound this. The audio mixing here, I think, on a technical side, is the biggest issue. Because some of the dialogue is completely kind of drowned out by this kind of, the mixing of the music. They have this kind of orchestral kind of score, and you simply can't understand what people are saying. And a lot of the time it's whispering. A lot of the time it's actors whose English isn't their first language, so they're kind of speaking in kind of like an accent and stuff, so they're hard to understand. You've got this music playing, or sometimes it's kind of background noise. The audio here is really kind of messy, and it makes it hard to understand. And the other thing that I would say with this is that I think the pacing and the kind of the editing is a little bit of a miss as well. So, you know, it kind of sets up our kind of our status quo at the beginning, and we have an action sequence, and we have the ultimately the kind of the kidnapping and the kind of the ramifications from that. But there's scenes here that I feel are really drawn out to the point where it kind of is ultimately a little dull. But there are other sequences, and in particular I feel that could have set up this kind of world a little bit better, that feel very truncated, and you don't ever really feel like you quite understand people's motivations and what their relationships are with one another, particularly because there's kind of a little bit of kind of double crossing and kind of things like that. So you're never really particularly sure about what's actually kind of going on, and this is kind of why I say, you know, it might be worth having a little bit of a, you know, research before this to get an idea of kind of who the players are, because I don't think the movie does a particularly kind of good job in kind of really taking the audience with you on this kind of journey. A lot of it is just kind of dialogue. It says, oh, you know, this person's done that, or that person's done this, or that person wants this. It's kind of, I'm not really following. Obviously, Jan Zizka, when we kind of see him on screen, he kind of, you know, he's all kind of consistent, and you know, and with him and his men, you can kind of see it. But it's the other characters outside of that, which I feel this kind of has a problem with. So this movie, I think, has all the pieces. It has the correct pieces. But when it's kind of put together to put this movie as a whole, it doesn't quite work. It feels like some of the pieces are in the wrong place, which ultimately means this movie is very frustrating, because I actually think, you know, when this movie was being filmed and stuff like that, I think it had the elements there to be a pretty kind of like, you know, an epic movie that can be well remembered. But as it stands, it kind of feels very convoluted. It feels messy and kind of sloppily kind of put together. On a technical side, I think the post-production on this movie, you know, it is possibly the real issue here. I feel when it was being made, I mean, there are still a few issues, but, you know, it was probably looking pretty good. But it's the latter half of the production I feel here could have been a little bit better, or no, not a little bit, quite significantly better. But as it stands at the moment, the movie is a little bit of a missed opportunity. I think if you still like the kind of like the movies like Braveheart, like Gladiator, but you know, there are other ones like Aaran the Knights Templar, which was kind of less well known. I think this movie fits more into those kind of movies, the kind of the less well known historical films that, you know, tend to go straight to kind of Blu-ray or what have you. And that's where I feel this movie kind of, you know, it lives in its current kind of state. You know, I guess its nearest comparison is probably something along the lines of Kingdom of Heaven, but even that I think was probably a little bit kind of like a better put together film. You know, I know the director's cut is better, but even the kind of the standard cut, you know, it's still a little bit kind of like messy, but you know, you can still follow it. I think this one is just kind of hard to follow. So ultimately, it's a 5 out of 10 for me. It's a convoluted film that's frustrating because you can see that a lot of effort was put into it, and the basics they've kind of got in here have the potential to be really good, but it just doesn't kind of gel. So it's a 5 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.